Welcome to the Sound on Sound recording and mixing podcast channel. I'm Mark Mynett, and in this episode we're looking at recording the electric guitar. Invented in the 1930s, an instrument whose unquestionable domination of so much modern music shows no sign of declining anytime soon. Before getting into the nitty-gritty of the engineering side of recording electric guitars though, let's firstly provide a bit of context. Firstly discussing clean and distorted tones, then a bit of housekeeping with sound at source principles, and then principles around how many rhythm tracks to record and sound layering techniques along the way. So we will be discussing recording clean electric guitars, but that's far less challenging than recording harmonically distorted electric guitars, and it's very simply because there's far less complexity in the sound. With a clean guitar sound, depending on performance, you'll get very little content over 1.5K. With distorted guitars, it can go right up to 7.5, and depending on the amount of distortion, far higher than that in the spectrum. Let's just give some context to distortion though. Obviously, distortion in recorded electric guitars has been around since the late 40s, early 50s, and there's some important reasons that I'll touch on why we perceive electric guitars as really loud. You know, you'll probably notice no matter how your volume is set, your playback volume, when you listen to distorted guitars, they always sound really loud and powerful and lots of energy and emotion. And it's actually to do with the way we experience the world as human beings. The human hearing system starts to distort when exposed to extreme sound levels. And also as the capabilities of our vocal cords are exceeded, normally through high levels of emotion, audible vocal distortion is produced. So right from an early age of human development, distortion tends to be associated with perceived loudness, power, aggression, energy, emotion, and intensity. A very brief summary of what harmonic distortion does to an electric guitar is that its existing harmonics get strengthened, and the accompanying natural compression means the ascending harmonic series becomes far more even in amplitude. So in other words, strengthened highs. And very interestingly, when playing dyads, triads or full chords, harmonic distortion can actually generate frequencies below the fundamental of the guitar's lowest open string, a subject we won't go into right now, but very interesting nonetheless. How does all this relate to guitar recording? Well, if you're recording clean tones, as I've already mentioned, there's far less complexity in the sound, very little over 1.5K. Whereas with harmonically distorted guitars, the most impact is between 1.5 and 7.5K. There's a lot of additional content there, and that brightness that means the guitar is perceived as far more proximate, that in-your-face perspective that people often refer to. In my experience and the experience of so many other producer engineers, rhythm sounds that provide a good feel and work well in a rehearsal room or live environment often fail to translate to recorded form, especially when heard within the context of the mix. The way distortion translates to a recorded format is a central issue here. Compared to guitar cab loudspeakers heard at source or when further amplified through a PA, lower levels of distortion are required for rhythm guitars to effectively translate via domestic hi-fi speakers, headphones, etc. Muddy or fizzy qualities caused by even slightly too much distortion gets heightened and accentuated through these playback systems. Excessive distortion also neutralises a guitar's dynamic content, which can obscure the clarity of the notes and rhythm patterns. So guitarists that favour a heavily saturated tone tend to be met with an indecipherable abrasive mush when their sound is translated via microphone and placed under the scrutiny of the studio environment. And of course, if you're tracking up these sources with the rhythm sounds, you get kind of like cumulative distortion. So the point I'm getting to here is that as much as possible, if you can get your guitarist to reduce their levels of distortion in their sound for the studio, what tends to happen is that the guitarists are compelled to sort of dig in and strike the strings far harder than otherwise in order to get the necessary attack and bite out of the rhythm sound, and in doing so the resulting performance conveys far more natural energy and aggression and a far more effective tone than with these qualities eclipsed by distortion. And the reason that I'm mentioning this first in this podcast is that it often takes a while for guitarists who are accustomed to playing with excessive distortion a bit of time to adjust to the feel of a more appropriate level. So when relevant, it's preferable for this to be put into practice during pre-production. If you're meeting the band in a pre-production session and you feel that the guitarist has got too much distortion, try and get them to adjust to a more appropriate level so that they can adjust to that before the studio session. Moving onwards, a couple of other 101s. Again, similar to with the bass, it is hard to overstate the importance of well set up instruments with accurate intonation, and particularly if you've got two separate guitarists, that both of their guitars are accurately intonated so that both can be used in the production. There are no excuses for poor tuning, but at the same time, problems initially identified as intonation or tuning could actually be performance related, and this is where, if your guitars are down-tuned, your guitarist should be compensating for the greater string excursion with thicker strings to reduce that impact. And same with bass again. New strings for any project of any significant, new strings are an absolute must. Likewise, tracking a DI is good engineering practice for any electric guitar recording, as this enables the extensive options afforded through reamping and emulation processing. Moving onwards, in this podcast I'm going to be discussing double tracking and quad tracking, so it is useful to briefly clarify these concepts. Double tracking the rhythm guitar is a standard production technique within most indie rock, metal based genres. Very simply, if a band features one guitarist and only one guitar performance is recorded, the resulting production tends to present an unbalanced stereo image with the guitar panned over to one side, or a very mono-based image with the signal panned to the centre. Using two mics to record the single rhythm guitar won't solve this quandary, no matter how the two signals are panned in the mix, as they will still feature the same performance. And time domain based technology, sort of automatic double tracking, trying to fool the listener that they're hearing two separate performances, has limited success. So consequently, if this guitarist, the only one in the band, tracks up his or her rhythm parts, in other words, records a further entirely separate performance, this means that one signal can be panned left, one signal panned right, and a wider stereo image is provided. So for clarity then, regardless of the number of guitarists in the band or the number of microphones used to record each performance, double track guitars refers to two entirely separate rhythm guitar performances, broadly one in each speaker, whereas quad track guitars refers to four entirely separate rhythm guitar performances, broadly speaking two in each speaker. And later on we'll be looking at techniques for varying the rhythm sound when recording either double track guitars or quad track guitars. Okay, let's move on to the actual recording side of the equation. First off, guitar cabs. If you're looking for quite a tight, hard, mid-range texture with kind of quite strong note definition, then I would recommend closed back cabinets. Open back or partially open back designs tend to soften the low and mid frequencies, which might suit the sound that you're after, but that's definitely worth mentioning. As far as setting up the cab in the live space, firstly remove the potential influence of unwanted sounds in the live space, so acoustic guitars, snare drums, etc. And set the guitar rig up in the previously established position for the snare drum. This was discussed in the drum recording podcast. At this point, try and spend some time in the live space with the guitarist, assessing how the guitar tone translates within this location. As I mentioned earlier, rhythm tone dialed in elsewhere, often a rehearsal room, often sounds substantially different within the more controlled environment of a recording studio. And spend time dialing that sound in so it is as close as possible to how you envisage the rhythm sound on the final production. And as mentioned in the bass podcast, you should be considering how the guitar and the bass will interact on the final production. In other words, if the rhythm guitars have got relatively scooped, attenuated mids, it's better to avoid the exact same frequency emphasis with the bass amp. And conversely, if you're going for a very pronounced mid-range sound on the guitars, you will generally want to look at attenuating the low mids, the mids on the bass amp, so that the low end of the bass sound is revealed and it can sit beneath the mid-range focused guitar content. So let's just have a quick listen to an audio example of that production perspective around the mids of the guitar and the relative mids of the bass. This is a track called Relinar from the latest Baron Carter EP, Shards of Black. What you're going to hear is that there's quite a lot of mid-range in the guitars. It's a very warm, thick, mid-range focused tone on the guitars. Conversely, because I knew that I was going for this frequency focus with the guitars, the bass amp sound was tracked with attenuated, reduced mids, more of a focus on the lows and the highs. And at the mix stage, I've attenuated the low mids of the bass at 185 with a medium Q by about 4-5 dB, and also at 670 Hertz by about 10 dB. And this means that the bass and the guitars are not fighting for the same spectral space. The bass is more about the lows and the note definition in the highs, and the guitars are more in the mid-range. And hopefully you'll hear that there's clarity to both the guitars and the bass because they're not masking, i.e. obscuring each other. Now let's have a listen to both the guitars and the bass with a mid-range focus, which means they're sort of like fighting for this spectral area. And you're going to hear that not only is the bass less clear, but also the guitars have less impact, they're less clear. And because of the resulting muddiness in the mix, the drums are slightly obscured as well. After dialing in your rhythm sound at source, it's good practice if you have the time and or the budget to find the best sounding speaker within that cabinet. And the way you can do this is set up 4 identical microphones, perhaps SM57s on the same point, half on, half off the dust cap, and record one take and find the best sounding speaker. If you do find that it's one of the lower speakers, do take time to invert the cabinet to get the microphone away from the reflective properties of the floor. At this point, it's good practice to think about the kind of rhythm sound you want for the final production. And is this a very dry, controlled sound or a more ambient sound? Certainly, if you capture a dry sound, you have got the option of making it ambient with artificial reverb or delay during the mix. If you've captured a very ambient sound at source, you're largely stuck with that sound. So in most instances, most producers tend to focus on close mics and isolation tactics that heavily reduce the ambient impact of the recording space from the microphone. That is, unless you are in a very nice sounding room and you want to set up a room mic as well. But let's stay with this idea of isolating the room from the recording. You can do this by setting up baffles around the cabinet, possibly one over across the top of the cabinet to prevent reflections from the roof, and this will give you a much drier, more controlled rhythm sound. You can of course isolate the sound and also have a room mic, and then you've got the option of both. You've isolated the room from the close mic and you've also got the option of the room mic as well. Give consideration to amp volume. You might want to spend some time doing tests to see at which point the amp is really delivering the valve qualities that you wish to the proceedings. And likewise, you might want to spend some time on mic selection. Certainly some of the best rhythm guitar sounds ever recorded have had a very straightforward approach to mic selection. It's hard to avoid mentioning the Shure SM57 when it comes to recording guitars, and the reason is, in brief, that the SM57 sub 200 Hz roll-off offsets the proximity effect of very close mic placements, which means that you can get the microphone very close to the cabinet, to the speaker cloth, or the speaker if you've removed the speaker grill. And the SM57 compensates for that proximity. Also, you get a broad attenuation curve centered at 400 Hz that kind of attenuates potentially muddy frequencies, and then you get a wide accentuation of brightness, particularly around 4 to 7K, which enhances a rhythm tone's essential presence content. And this favourably corresponds with what is required from a close mic placement translating rhythm guitar tones. And this is why countless highly regarded rhythm tones have been captured with just a single SM57 at close range. In fact, if you're struggling to get a functional tone from a well-placed 57, so maybe half an inch to an inch from the grill cloth, and half on, half off the dust cap, if this doesn't provide a strong rhythm tone, then this could suggest problems with your acoustic space or the quality of your mic pre, deficiencies with the amp cab being used or the guitar itself, or shortcomings with the guitarist's performance technique. Along with the SM57, the Sennheiser MD421 is well suited to recording rhythm guitars, often in combination with the 57, which we'll come to shortly. Incidentally, the 421 includes a 5-position switch for rolling off bass frequencies, labelled as M for music, which doesn't apply any additional roll-off through to S for speech. So I would recommend leaving it on M for music. And this results in the microphone roll-off taking place around 90 Hz rather than 200 Hz with the SM57. Additionally, the MD421 doesn't provide any low mid attenuation, but has a significant sensitivity boost in the high mids through to upper mids, starting around 1K. Of course, there are lots of other options with mic selection when recording rhythm guitars. For example, the Royer R121 ribbon mic, often in combination with the SM57 or the Sennheiser MD421, and there's obviously the Bayer Dynamic M160, Audix i5, Audio-Technica ATM25, etc. As a general principle though, if you're looking for a greater level of sensitivity and detail in the highs, a condenser mic is more likely to be valuable, but do bear in mind that the extended low frequency response of most condenser mics tends to be less effective at offsetting unwanted proximity effect. Let's move on to mic placement. Finding an optimal mic placement is easier with a basic understanding of loudspeaker frequency propagation patterns. There is a widely held idea that the centre of a guitar speaker, in other words the dust cap, produces the greatest level of high frequencies, whereas the edge of the speaker cone produces the greatest level of low frequencies. This is only partly correct. In reality, there is no specific region that produces the most low frequencies, as below a certain point, which is often around 900 Hertz with a 12-inch speaker, the low frequencies are radiated at exactly the same level across the entire speaker face. A useful analogy from a close mic speaker front perspective then is to think of the speaker's diaphragm acting like a piston, the width of the speaker which pushes out low and low mid frequencies in a uniform, even manner. And the greatest amount of high frequencies, as I've already mentioned, are from the centre of the speaker. I'd avoid miking the very centre of the dust cap, as there's a little bit of noise bouncing around in there. So a great starting position for a close mic is roughly 1/2 inch to 1 inch from the grill cloth, half on, half off the dust cap. From here, the two attributes that we're wanting to control and balance are the high frequencies, which obviously need to be bright but without being fizzy and abrasive, and the lows, which need to be full and clear, hopefully whilst remaining tight and controlled. And if these two attributes can be successfully balanced through mic adjustments, obviously given that the sound source is right, there should be clear and effective mids, the foundation of any great rhythm tone. So staying with the highs then, if the sound is too bright or slightly abrasive, move the microphone slightly away from the dust cap for the moment whilst keeping the mic on axis, in other words, pointing directly at the speaker and keeping it the same distance from the speaker front. And as you move away from the dust cap position, this will result in the microphone no longer being directly within the brightest part of the speaker. Let's have a quick listen to this mic placement principle in practice. In other words, starting at a half on, half off the dust cap position, then keeping the microphone the same distance from the speaker cloth, moving away from the centre of the speaker towards the midway point, and then finally towards the far edge of the speaker cone. Midway point of the speaker edge furthest away from the centre, moving back to the centre. So hopefully you will have heard there the quite drastic change in the way that the mic position reduces the brightness and reduces the perception of the distortion in the guitar sound, with a smoother sounding guitar as a result, but potentially at the deficiency of brightness and bite and aggression that you'll need from this style of guitar tone. You can also consider off-axis mic placements, which means angling the microphone so it's not pointed directly at the speaker, perhaps away from the centre of the speaker, pointing at the dust cap. And as you increase the angle, increasingly more towards sort of 45 degrees, you get a different kind of reduced brightness than just simply moving it away from the centre of the speaker on axis. So that's worth considering. Also worth considering is double mic approaches. For example, one microphone on axis and one microphone off axis. In fact, one microphone on axis and another microphone off axis at 45 degrees, sometimes referred to as the Fredman technique, after Fredrik Nordström, a Swedish producer. The on-axis mic will be quite bright and aggressive, and the off-axis mic will be a lot darker, certainly less abrasive, and you've got the ability to balance those two qualities during the mix. At the same time, we want to be considering the low frequency qualities of the guitar sound. And from this perspective, it's about proximity effect from a directional microphone and the increased low frequency response when it's close to a sound source. So very simply, if the low end of the guitar sound is just not tight enough, it's not clear enough, start backing the microphone off maybe 1 inch, 2 inches at a time until the low frequency content is tighter. And obviously this is given that the sound at source is as hoped for. Preferably, if you're trying to keep a very clear, focused sound, I would try to avoid going any further away than 6 inches from the speaker grill. And this is because as you move further away from the speaker, you've got a greater chance that other speakers within the cabinet will combine with the speaker that the microphone is focused on, which causes slight phase anomalies and also obviously increases the potential for ambience to impact the sound. At this point, it's to be hoped that you're hearing a guitar sound that really represents the blueprint for the production, the blueprint of the guitars that you had in mind for the production. That is very, very close to that. And so we can now turn to thinking about how we now track up that rhythm sound. If you record the same rhythm sound twice, the exact same rhythm sound, same guitar, same microphone, same amp cab, etc., and this is with the view for one of those signals to be left and one of those signals to be right, you're not going to get a particularly wide stereo image. And that's very simply because the greater the differences between left and right, the wider the perceived stereo image. So if it's exactly the same in the left and right, it's not going to be a particularly wide image. Now, if it's one rhythm guitarist in the band and you're taking 2 rhythm performances, this is double tracking 2 completely separate rhythm performances, as discussed earlier, giving you this wider stereo image, you need to consider how you're going to differentiate the sound to provide this wider stereo image, and at the same time bearing in mind the guitarist's tonal identity. You don't want a completely different sound in left and right, as this might completely betray the tonal identity of the guitarist. So simple ways about going about this is maybe changing the speaker cab so that it's different speakers in the cab. For example, it might be GT75 Celestions in one cabinet, and in the other cabinet it's got vintage 30s or Celestion Greenback 25 watt speakers, which will sound tonally different. Or it might be that you change guitar, or it might be simply that you change microphones or microphone placement between different takes. And that should be enough to sufficiently vary the sound, particularly given the different performance nuances that there will be between the 2 different rhythm takes. So let's have a listen to this principle with Baron Carter, which is a 1 guitar band. And so I didn't want to vary the tones too significantly between left and right, as clearly it would start to resemble a twin guitar band. In this instance, what I did is kept the same guitar being used, the same amp, but changed the cabinet speakers and changed the microphones, changed the microphone placement as well. Let's listen to both guitars together. Now let's listen to the left guitar tone. And now the right guitar tone, where hopefully you will hear that the tonal identity of the guitar is broadly similar, but there's enough differences in the drive, the mid-range and the highs and the lows to provide a wider stereo image. Whereas if you've got 2 guitarists in the band, this is where it gets interesting, as hopefully you will sufficiently vary the rhythm sound to represent the tonal identity of those guitarists, and in the proceedings get a much wider sounding stereo image to the production. And what I recommend here is obviously using the amps of each individual guitarist. Hopefully they'll use different amps, and that will hopefully represent their tonal identity, and the different amps should be enough to provide that variation in sound. But of course, you would like to think that they will be using guitars that are different. Make sure that they're intonated. Alternatively, you might want to change the cabs and the microphones, or any and all of the above, to vary those sounds. Last thing to consider is quad track guitars, and this is obviously 4 entirely separate rhythm performances, whether it's one guitarist in the band doing 4 separate rhythm takes or 2 guitarists doing 2 separate rhythm takes each. And this is likened to violins playing the same part in orchestras. The different nuances in the performance parts thickens and provides a richer texture to the sound. Importantly though, it can make it more challenging to get the drums to punch through in the mix and the bass sound as well. And it's obviously more time consuming to get these 4 rhythm takes. But certainly if you're after a thicker rhythm sound, I don't know, I'll give you a reference, something like the thick mid-range sound of Alice in Chains' guitar sound, quad tracking might be the way to go. Certainly if you're looking at faster performances and really fast tremolo picking, I would advise against quad tracking. It will usually end up being a little bit messy. And in any instance, your decision for quad tracking needs to be performance dependent. If your guitarist or guitarists are struggling getting 2 rhythm takes down that are sufficiently tight, I would also advise against quad tracking. With quad tracking, 2 different approaches. Some producers, some bands, for example Machine Head, would track the same rhythm take 4 times. They would take the one sound and track it 4 different times, but obviously this would have 2 different guitarists involved, with them being a 2 guitar band, and that influence of 2 different rhythm guitarists would provide the greater stereo width. Other techniques are varying the sounds between each take, and you get a different frequency emphasis between each take that's tracking each side. And again, the techniques that I've discussed for varying the rhythm takes, different cabs, different microphones, different amps, can be used and experimented with to thicken up and provide different options as to how these signals are leveled and blended and treated at the mix stage. Briefly worth mentioning, if you're double tracking your rhythm guitars, is a production technique called multi-amp cab recording. Here, rather than the one rhythm guitar signal each side involving 1 amp and 1 cab, regardless of this being double mic'd, in this instance you're sending the same performance through different guitar rigs. So one performance through multiple different guitar rigs. And this is really well suited to achieving bigger guitar sounds, and again less suited to rhythm performances that are very fast performances. And there's a number of different approaches here, depending on whether these are recorded simultaneously, which involves splitting the signal, or sequentially, which involves reamping. What you can do is adopt different drive levels, so perhaps one rhythm performance with a really high drive level and the other with a lesser influence of distortion. And again, those can be blended at the mix, and interestingly you can add more of the track with more distortion during the chorus and pull that back perhaps in the verse. Alternatively, it can be an approach where you've got different frequency attributes of the rigs. In other words, one can be heavily focused on the lows, perhaps one focused on the mids and one in the highs. And again, this is a very powerful technique, and it's very easily something that you can get wrong, that it can sound really fake, because you can get phase anomalies. So try and make sure that you're capturing each take with the microphone the same distance from the cab is an important consideration, and it's perhaps something worth considering if you've got the time and perhaps the budget to look into this technique. And as I say, at the mix stage, it gives you a wider degree of options for presenting different qualities, perhaps more mids or highs at different sections of the song, likewise different distortion attributes at different sections of the song. So far in this Sound on Sound podcast, we haven't considered guitar solos. Importantly, a majority of the considerations we've looked at so far, so finding the best speaker, finding the optimal amp volume, neutralising the ambience of the room, microphone selection, microphone placement, all of those techniques remain relevant to guitar solos. Usually what changes is just the way that the amp is dialed in at source, which might be the same amp as the rhythm sound. Usually though, it involves a greater degree of mid-range to get a more singing guitar tone, and usually a greater injection of distortion into the sound, again just to get a little bit more sustain out of the guitar solo sound. Let's have another listen to Baron Carter. In this instance, it's actually the same rig as the rhythm tone, but in this instance, it's just increased mids and slightly increased drive, and you'll hear that this allows the guitar solo to still cut through the rhythm guitar sounds. At this point, it's really important to acknowledge that many of you listening to this will be using amp modelling, profiling and emulation technology, be that hardware or software for your guitar tones. And so it's important to take some of the considerations we've discussed so far and kind of translate this to this technology. Of course, there are different software products that enable the user to select the microphone and microphone position, enable double mic positions, different cabs, different amps, etc. So a lot of the previous discussion is relevant to those approaches. And likewise, the discussion about reducing distortion levels when recording is entirely relevant, as all the discussion for varying tones and double tracking and quad tracking. But there's just a few last aspects of amp sims that I'd like to discuss, and that is so many of the presets have an excess of abrasive qualities up in the sort of like 3 to 5.5K region. And it's important to look at techniques that can address that so that you can get your sounds when you record them much closer to as you want them in the final mix. In other words, if you're able to use graphic EQ to improve the sound of as you're recording, you'll respond to the tone in a different way. It'll be much closer to that heard on the final production, and it'll also increase your knowledge about how to dial in guitar sounds at source. A really important principle here is low pass filters. Really look at adopting a low pass filter, sweeping it down from about 10K and sweeping down that low pass filter so that it's really attenuating abrasive qualities. Certainly it depends on the guitar signal, but you can usually get it down to about 7.5K, even lower if you've got excessive distortion and excessive abrasion in that region. Then the next one is attenuating where the abrasion is most acute. If you're able to sweep a tight Q curve between roughly 3 and 5K and find the center of the storm where it's most abrasive, and also establish what region of the guitar is abrasive. Is it just a very fine notch that you can adjust with surgical EQ, a very tight EQ curve, or is it a broader range of abrasive content? So what you're going to hear in this audio example is me sweeping a significantly boosted tight EQ curve between roughly 3 and 5K, and I'm establishing where the abrasion is located in that guitar sound. In this instance, I find that it's around 3.3K, and at the end of the audio clip, you'll hear that frequency region being quite significantly attenuated, providing a much more pleasing rhythm sound as a result. in addition to dialing in the low end of the sound with the tone controls on the modeler or the sim, look at high-pass filters to really adopt it. It's kind of doing so in an equivalent way to microphone technique to control the lows and to get the low end as tight and controlled as possible. And in this instance, sweeping up from maybe 40 up to sort of 70, maybe 75, 80 can really tighten the low end of the guitar sound, particularly if you use that in conjunction with the lows. Work out where the lows are really dialing in the lower frequencies of your guitars and how that interacts with the high pass filter. And of course, we've discussed the highs, we've discussed the lows, but the foundation of any great guitar sound is the mid-range. That brings us to the end of this Sound on Sound podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure you dial in next month for the podcast focused on vocal recording. See you then.
Thank you for listening, and be sure to check out the show notes page for this episode, where you'll find further information along with web links and details of all the other episodes. Oh, and just before you go, let me point you to the soundonsound.com/podcast website page, where you can explore what's playing on our other channels.